Brace yourself. Here come 11 of the most troublesome words in the entire Bible. In fact, you might well be tempted to get out a pair of scissors, hack out just this one verse, and just decide to live your life according to the other 31,172 verses in the Old and New Testaments. Here it is. 1 Corinthians 7:1 from the King James Version. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. Well, if that doesn't jolt you, here's an alternative reading of that same passage in the NCV. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. You may be thinking that we might find some relief in other versions or translations. Well, here's the verse as quoted in the New International Version. It is good for a man not to marry. Then the next 8 verses talk explicitly about the sexual relationship within marriage. Now, I know your right arm may be poised, calculating the proper trajectory to turn off today's devotional from your computer at this very moment. So let me just say, hold on, there is more. Let me state categorically that I and my family and most all my associates are all happily married Christian men who do have wives. And in the biblically polite way of expressing it, we do touch our spouses on a regular basis. But why then does this verse in the Bible say such a seemingly harsh, obviously contradictory, impossible to obey thing? Here in chapter 7, we'll endeavor to examine not only what Paul said, but explore some of the deeper issues about the Bible itself. What do we do with hard verses such as this one? Where do Bible writers back in a place like Corinth get off telegraphing advice like this down to you and me here in the 21st century? Hence our title for these next 5 messages. I hope you don't mean me, Brother Paul. Let me suggest one point immediately and then retreat to the safety of a story. First of all, friend, it's very dangerous to read just one verse in the Bible. In fact, in this case, it was half a verse, because if you read all of 1 Corinthians 7, a certain reasonableness falls into place and we stop shaking our heads and our fists so vociferously. First, though, my little story. Good Bible students must never build a doctrine on just one verse. That's dangerous. No, we compare Scripture with Scripture. A dedicated Christian in my own denomination was reading faithfully some of the books in our denomination of one of his faithful church founders. He took the view that everything this person wrote, everything, was meant exactly for him. It was counsel from God to him personally. One particular book contained some excerpts from letters that had gone through various people. And as he read through some of these letters, these testimonies, and scrupulously applied them to his own life, he encountered the troublesome sentence, "You eat too much." What? Was he eating too much? The author hadn't written the letter to him, but it was his view that all things published by this particular individual did apply to him. There it was. You eat too much. Immediately the man went on a diet. He cut way back and lost quite a bit of weight. Unfortunately, sometime later, he happened to be reading the same book again, and he spotted that troublesome line, "You eat too much." Although he'd reduced his food intake, here was what he believed to be a message from heaven, and so he chopped his diet in half again. Still later, when that line popped off the page a 3rd and 4th time, he cut back some more. Fortunately, He finally came to his senses, but not before confessing to his friends that he had almost obeyed the Lord to the point of dieting himself into the grave. Well, does that mean that we can indeed get some scissors out and just cut out the verses that we don't think God meant for us? Now, here Paul is writing a letter to a certain group of people, the Christians in Corinth. Marriage relationships were all mixed up there. Promiscuity was all over the place there, even in the temples. It was the culture. Times were hard and religious persecution was brewing there, meaning that a brand new marriage and all the responsibilities that went with it were going to be exceedingly difficult. But what does that have to do with us down here today? Can we just ignore the things that don't seem to us to be written for us? Would you allow me to share several personal convictions before we even wade into the deeper waters of chapter 7? First of all, I am committed to all 3,172 verses in the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation. If God intended 1 Corinthians 7:1 to be in his book, then we want to have it in front of us no matter what it says or to whom it was written. It shouldn't be our intention to ignore anything in the Bible. Second, I'm grateful that God calls his people to be diligent students, thinking men and women. The process of communicating heaven's ideals to our planet through the written word isn't foolproof or easy. We encounter hard things, difficult verses, apparent contradictions, long passages that appear to have no relevance. Why are they there, we wonder? But you see, the process of grappling and digging and searching and yes, even debating seems to generally be good for us. And it's something God permits. Here's another point. As we explore the mysterious process that we call inspiration, how God moves upon the mind of a servant such as Paul to get his truths communicated, one thing becomes clear almost immediately. The apostle doesn't just hold out his hand with a pen and have God move the ink across the scroll. No. Whatever inspiration means, it's obvious that Paul's mind is active and that his own thoughts and personality and even opinions blend into that divinely protected process. He's not in a trance. Inspiration is a topic that many Christians debate, and we could go off onto a sidetrack and spend the next 10 devotional talks on it. And that might be politically astute. But I would invite you to just skip down to verse 10, in which Paul states, "To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband." Just 2 verses later, he says, in contrast, "To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her." That's verse 12. The Living Bible paraphrases the passage this way. "Now, for those who are married, I have a command, not just a suggestion." Verse 10. "Here I want to add some suggestions of my own," he says in verse 12. These are not direct commands from the Lord, but they seem right to me. Let me hasten to add a conservative interpretation of this. Sometimes Paul tells his hearers, here's something the Lord has commanded. You can take this as coming from heaven. And the reason he says that is because Jesus Christ himself, who lived on earth, had already made a publicly recorded earthly pronouncement on that very question. For example, should a husband and wife split up? No. Jesus himself said no in Luke 16, verse 18. It is a redundant and childish exercise to wonder aloud, Can I do this thing? Is this just Paul's personal opinion? No. This message comes from heaven because Christ himself clearly expressed his own divine will on the matter. In verse 12, however, in discussing what a follower of God should do whose spouse isn't a believer in Christianity, well, we have no record that Jesus ever talked about that. The Gospels don't include anything from Christ dealing with this particular question. Thus, Paul says clearly, okay, I'll tell you what I think. Here's my opinion on this, and I'm confident it is right. Now, here's the important point. Listen. The Christian who believes in the process of inspiration will accept that God is guiding Paul's mind and thoughts in both pronouncements. When Paul quotes Jesus, God is guiding. And when Paul shares his own opinions, God guides in a supernatural way there as well. True, Paul is still a human being, a vibrant, thinking, opinionated, sin-stained person like you and me. But the Spirit of God directed this particular unique man when he wrote his letters to the people at Corinth. Paul, being who he was, said to those Christians, you know, this is a tough town and a tough time to be married. Oh, but you and I read his letter from a different town and a different time and ask ourselves, what do we do with this? The text notes of one NIV study Bible remind us that Paul's recommendation here does not apply to all times and all situations. Here's one more hopefully relevant illustration. When Senator Bob Dole served in the United States Senate, Democrats and Republicans alike regarded Dole as the source of a lot of wisdom. What does Dole think? Was a common question in the halls of Congress. He was well respected, well known for his snappy humor, his clever, barbed one-liners. Often in a meeting when Senator Dole would lean over and quietly make a comment, or even just an aside to someone next to him, all the baby-faced freshman senators and congressmen within 40 feet would lean forward eagerly. What'd he say? What'd he say? Did you catch it? Probably you could say to those craning to hear, hey, he's not really talking to you. I know, but I want to hear anyway. The man's got something to say. If God had something to say through his servant Paul to some long ago Christians living in Corinth, well, I'd like to lean in real close and find out what it was. How about you? Keep listening, as we'll eavesdrop a whole lot more.